This is a story about the best-selling board game of all time, Monopoly. The Monopoly myth is that one man created it in a burst of genius, but the reality is a lot more complicated, and it's fascinating. The story has it all: the Supreme Court, the battle against capitalism, some Quakers, and even a political campaign. Stay tuned for the story of Monopoly. Welcome to the Science of Creativity, your home for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention. I'm your host, Dr. Keith Sawyer. My mission is to inspire you with stories of brilliant creators and world-changing inventions. You'll learn about the latest psychological studies and gain insights about creativity that will help you reach your full creative potential. We often think that creativity comes from the mind of a brilliant lone genius. The Monopoly creation story shows us how creativity really happens, from social networks and collaborations. The Monopoly story shows that creativity is never the work of one person. But the world seems to love this lone genius myth, and what we've heard about Monopoly is no different. Monopoly is the best-selling board game of all time. It sold more than 200 million sets in over 80 countries. When Monopoly was released by Parker Brothers in 1934, it was the height of the Depression. Parker Brothers was losing money because no one could afford to buy toys. It wasn't the best time to try to sell something frivolous like a game. But Monopoly took off like wildfire, and it saved the company. How did they come up with such a successful game? Who invented it? It's a fascinating story, and it reveals how creativity really works, not just with games, but with all inventions and discoveries. Monopoly is a pretty brutal game after all. The way you win is to drive everyone else into poverty. It's the dark side of capitalism. In fact, Monopoly was banned for decades in most communist countries, including Russia, China, North Korea, and Cuba. Think about it, Monopoly teaches you how to be an evil robber baron. In the 1960s, a lot of American revolutionaries hated capitalism too, and they didn't like Monopoly either. One of those revolutionaries was Ralph Ansbach, an economics professor in San Francisco. In 1973, he published a game he called Anti-Monopoly. It looked just like the original game, with a square board, same number of spaces, paper money, a lot of other familiar features. But there was one big difference: it attacked capitalism. Ansbach couldn't find a publisher to make the game, so he hired an outfit to make the game for him. To everyone's surprise, it was a big hit. Ansbach sold 200,000 copies in the first year. Of course, Parker Brothers found out, and of course, they did what companies always do. They sued him for stealing their copyright and their trademark. Parker Brothers won the lawsuit, and they got a court order to destroy 37,000 copies of Anti-Monopoly. It was a sad day for Ralph Ansbach, but he didn't give up. He appealed the judge's decision. He came up with a really crazy idea. He would try to get a court to invalidate Parker Brothers' rights to the game. He found some intriguing evidence that Parker Brothers wasn't really the inventor of Monopoly, that they stole it from someone else. Ansbach left his job to work full-time on his Monopoly lawsuit. He took out a second mortgage on his house. He went into debt on his credit cards. He dug into the libraries and the old legal databases. And he struck gold. He discovered the true story of Monopoly. What he discovered surprised everyone. Parker Brothers did not create Monopoly after all. When Ansbach showed the judge what he had found, the judge invalidated Parker Brothers' copyright and their trademark. But Parker Brothers wouldn't give up. They appealed all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was busy with more important things, and they decided to pass on the Monopoly lawsuit. In 1984, Ralph Ansbach finally beat Parker Brothers. Well, what was it that Ansbach discovered? It's an amazing story with so many twists and turns. It involves hundreds of board game players over many decades. The first version of Monopoly was created in 1904, 30 years before Parker Brothers released the original version. This true story challenges our lone genius myths, and it reveals the collaborative nature of creativity. official story told by Parker Brothers was that Monopoly was invented by an unemployed radiator repairman named Charles Darrow in 1934. Darrow had a flash of insight to make a real estate trading game. This official story aligns with the common belief that creativity comes from solitary people having great ideas. Parker Brothers bought the patent from him and released the game in 1935. It was the height of the Depression, and it was a big risk to invest in printing thousands of games. Families didn't have much extra cash, but the gamble paid off. Monopoly was a huge success. It sold 250,000 copies in 1935. The next year, it sold 1.8 million copies. The game was such a big hit that everyone was talking about the Monopoly craze. News reporters and papers around the country were writing stories about how Monopoly was spreading around the country. Every small town reporter wanted to interview the inventor of Monopoly for their stories, so they called up Parker Brothers. The company was happy to introduce the reporters to the inventor, Charles Darrow. Darrow was born in Maryland. He grew up in Pittsburgh. He settled in Germantown, Pennsylvania. He took jobs in plumbing, engineering, radiator repair. He did whatever he could to get by. It was the Depression after all. He repaired electric irons. He patched concrete. He walked dogs. He hand-cut plywood to make jigsaw puzzles. He invented a bunch of new games, including one that he called Bug. When the reporters called Darrow to find out how he got the idea for Monopoly, he was happy to give them a story. But it was a false story, and this is what Ralph Ansbach discovered 40 years later. The reason why the reporters were so willing to believe Darrow's story was that it aligned with the lone genius view of creativity. Here's what Darrow told the reporters. In his spare time, and he had a lot of it because he was unemployed, he was reading a book about a Depression-era schoolboy. The boy was a student at a Latin school, which was a type of college preparatory school. But the boy wasn't a very good student and he flunked out. His fallback option was to attend what was called a commercial school. There, boys would learn clerical skills that businesses needed, like writing letters, reviewing contracts, balancing accounts. Instead of college, they went straight into business. At the commercial school in this novel, the teachers created a clever way to teach business. They gave all of the boys cardboard stock certificates and paper money. They led these students in a school-wide activity where the boys would buy and sell stocks. This way, they'd learn about the stock market, about negotiating, and about keeping accounts all at once. It was a pretty clever teaching method. Darrow went on to tell the reporters that this novel gave him a sudden burst of inspiration. Maybe this would make a good board game. He went out to his workshop and he started cutting pieces of paper and cardboard. He got some markers and he drew out a playing board. He cut houses and hotels out of wood. He got a patent in 1935. He took it to Parker Brothers and they loved it. It was a classic story of invention. Solitary lone genius, sudden inspiration. We often think that creativity comes from having big ideas, so it's easy to believe that it really happened this way. There's just one problem with the story. It was a complete lie. Charles Darrow did not invent Monopoly. Monopoly emerged from a collaborative web of thousands of people over 30 years. Darrow didn't tell Parker Brothers the real story about how he copied the game from some Quaker friends in Atlantic City, and then he fraudulently applied for the patent. The real story is a story of how creativity really works. It's a story about collaboration, sharing, and social networks. In fact, it really is a story about the battle against capitalism, but not just Ralph Ansbach's battle. The original goal of Monopoly was to fight capitalism, and the game was invented during the robber baron era in America in 1904 by a Quaker named Lizzie McGee. The real invention story starts with another anti-capitalist almost 100 years before, the economist Henry Lloyd George. In 1879, George published a book that became a bestseller. By 1897, the book had sold 5 million copies. It's still one of the top-selling economics books of all time. It's called Progress and Poverty, and it advocated what's called the single tax system. The system is complicated, but basically the idea is that you only tax land. People who own more land pay more tax. People who don't own land don't pay any tax. A lot of people supported this idea because the tax was progressive. People without much money didn't pay anything, and the richest people paid a lot. It's no surprise that the single tax was opposed by powerful forces, like, of course, anyone who owned land. Single tax didn't go anywhere. Although it had its fans, Winston Churchill was a big supporter. There's even a town that was founded in 1900 as a single tax community, Arden, Delaware. Henry Lloyd George ran for mayor of New York City twice, but he was never elected to office. Single tax system never went anywhere during Henry Lloyd George's lifetime, and it faded away from economic history. Some of the biggest supporters of the single tax system were the Quakers. Up and down the East Coast, Quakers were advocating for this socialist utopia. When George's political campaigns went nowhere and the single tax system was losing traction, a Virginia Quaker named Lizzie McGee decided that she had to do something. Her idea was to design a board game that would teach the virtues of the single tax system. She called it the landlord's game. The board game was a giant square. You started on a corner that was called Mother Earth, and it was no secret that this was an anti-capitalist game. The spaces on the board had titles like the Sokum Lighting System and Beggarman's Court, and even the Poorhouse. McGee's game came with 2 sets of rules. In the first set of rules, you played by the single tax system. All of the players got equally successful, and everyone lived happily ever after in a socialist utopia. The second set of rules were the capitalist rules. Everyone fought tooth and nail, and one person got rich and screwed everyone else. By playing both games, players would realize how great the single tax was and how evil capitalism was. Just like Charles Darrow's 1935 version of Monopoly, McGee's game board had 40 spaces, 22 properties, 4 railroads, a jail space, and a go-to-jail space. McGee got a patent on her game in 1904. She tried to sell it to Parker Brothers. They rejected it. They gave her a list of flaws they'd identified. For example, they said the game didn't have a start and an end place. The player just went endlessly around and around. But McGee wasn't about making money. She was about selling the world on the single tax system. So she taught some of her Quaker friends how to play. And guess what? It turned out to be a pretty fun game. The game started to catch on. Other people wanted a copy, but you couldn't buy it anywhere. You had to make your own copy. Lizzie McGee made some copies for her friends. Those friends made their own copies, and the game started to spread, one handmade game at a time. It spread up and down the East Coast, carried by Quakers. In 1906, McGee moved to Chicago, and the landlord's game started to spread in the Midwest. People would use sheets of canvas or paper or even a tablecloth, and they would draw the big square themselves. For playing pieces, they used whatever small things they had around the house: keys, rings, thimbles. Some players used the charms on their charm bracelets. Many of these old game boards are beautiful, and they're still in private collections. As people copied the game, they modified the original rules and they added their own rules. By about 1910, a new rule had spread across the country, the monopoly rule. This is the game we know today. You can charge more rent if you own all of the properties of one color. This rule was not in McGee's original patent. Lizzie McGee thought that players would prefer the single tax version of the rules. After all, the whole point was to show that capitalism was bad, single tax was good. But ironically, players loved the capitalist rules. Even the Quakers. The single tax version faded away. The landlord's game expanded dramatically after 1910. It grew beyond the network of Quaker communities. Lizzie McGee was no longer in charge. The game belonged to the collaborative web of creators. It took on a life of its own. New ideas and new rules popped up all the time. If the rule was fun, it would catch on and spread from city to city. The landlord's game was popular on many college campuses. Game collectors have boards made by fraternity brothers at Princeton, Haverford, Swarthmore, and Williams. By 1913, the game was international. It was played in Scotland. There was a London version that was called, and I don't know why, Brer Fox and Brer Rabbit. An economics professor at the University of Pennsylvania named Scott Nearing used the game with his students to show them that monopolies were bad for the economy. Professor Roy Stryker at Columbia University used his version of the game to teach the same lessons. In 1923, Lizzie McGee had moved back to the DC area. She got a second patent on a new version of the game. She was getting a little bit frustrated that everyone loved to play the capitalist version, so her new game was even more explicit about how good the single tax was. She called the capitalist version of the rules the landlord's game, same as before, but her new single tax version she called prosperity. Everyone had a healthy and a successful life together as equals. You couldn't go out and buy the landlord's game. If you liked it, you had to make your own copy. Somewhere along the way, a custom emerged. When you made your copy, you would change all of the space names to be roads and neighborhoods in your city. So every copy of the game was different. Roy Stryker's version at Columbia University in New York City had spaces for Fifth Avenue, the Bowery, and Wall Street. Somewhere along the way, the game began to be called Monopoly. It was named after the rule that you could charge more if you owned a full set of one color. That actually made more sense than the landlord's game because there weren't really any landlords in the game anymore. The game's rules had changed so much over the years. Ruth Hoskins was a Quaker living in Indianapolis, and she first played the landlord's game in 1929. She loved it, and she continued to play this Indianapolis version with her friends. Soon after, she moved to Atlantic City in New Jersey, so she had to make her own copy. Of course, she named the board spaces after streets in Atlantic City. Then, a man named Charles Todd from Germantown, Pennsylvania, was on vacation in Atlantic City. He met some friends who had the Atlantic City version of Monopoly. He liked it so much that he took it back to his home in Germantown, Pennsylvania. Instead of making his own Germantown City version, he kept playing the Atlantic City version. One night, he invited over his friends, Charles and Esther Darrow. Darrow loved the game, and he asked for a copy of the rules. He took the rules back home to Philadelphia, and he made his own version of the game. Then he filed for a patent. He used the same board design and the same rules. He even kept the Atlantic City space names. His patent was granted. You can't blame the patent officers in Washington, D.C. for not knowing the real history. You can't blame them for not knowing that Darrow had stolen a game that had emerged from a collaborative web of thousands of players with decades of tiny modifications and invention. Darrow took his version of the game to Parker Brothers. They rejected it. They said it took too long to play, but Darrow had seen how popular the game was. He was convinced that he could sell it. He made 500 copies on his own. He started to sell it at department stores in Philadelphia, and it quickly sold out. So he used those profits to make 7,500 more copies. Those were selling pretty fast too when he got a call from Parker Brothers. They had changed their mind. They decided to buy the game after all. It's purely an accident of history that the game we know and love has spaces named after streets in Atlantic City, New Jersey. If Darrow had encountered the game in New York, today we might be playing the New York version of the game made by Roy Stryker. Actually, with New York City being the symbol of capitalism the world over, it would probably make more sense to have the space names be places in New York City. But we're still playing the Atlantic City version of the game. Now let's jump forward again to the 1970s, when Professor Ralph Ansbach came out with his game, Anti-Monopoly, the 30-year history that led from the landlord's game in 1904 to Monopoly in 1934 had been long forgotten. Ansbach stumbled on the real story from a chance meeting with an old Quaker who remembered the game before Charles Darrow came out with it in 1934. Ansbach started to dig deeper. He discovered that this story was true. Charles Darrow had not invented the game, and the patent was invalid. Professor Ansbach put together all of his research in a very convincing package. He had photos of old boards that were handmade from Scotland to the Midwest to New York City. He had interviews with very old Quakers. The mountain of evidence was overwhelming, and it convinced the judge Parker Brothers' patent was invalid. The court held that the game was a folk tradition that you couldn't patent, sort of like if you tried to patent jump rope or an old card game like Rummy. Way before Charles Darrow got his 1934 patent, the name Monopoly had been used for years by players up and down the East Coast, so the judge ruled that no one could claim to own a game with that name. Parker Brothers appealed and appealed. They appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court was busy with other important matters. They denied to hear the appeal. In 1983, the patent and the trademark was invalidated. The battle was over. Ralph Ansbach had won. He could continue to market his game anti-monopoly. Parker Brothers lost their rights to the name and to the game. They no longer own the suffix "opoly" on games. The true story of how Monopoly was created is a story of collaboration and invention. Monopoly emerged unpredictably from what I call a collaborative web. I love the Monopoly story because it shows that the lone genius view of creativity is so often false. We love the myth of the solitary creator, especially when it's an entrepreneur like Charles Darrow with a rags to riches story. But the Monopoly story shows how often creativity emerges unpredictably, with twists and turns and dead ends that don't continue, like the single tax version of the game. No single person is in charge. Instead, the collaborative web is the source of invention. After Lizzie McGee shared her game with her Quaker friends, then it moved on to professors and fraternity brothers and even to Charles Darrow. The game was out of her hands. I love this story because it's such a clear contrast between the lone genius myth of invention and the reality of collaboration. The myth is that ideas come from a lone genius, someone who is alone, whereas the reality is that it comes from groups and collaboration, people who are together. The myth is that creativity comes from one big idea, like a flash of insight that comes suddenly. The reality is that inventions come from lots of small ideas over time, small sparks that build together, and they don't have to all be from the same person either. The small sparks are distributed through the collaborative web. And the third myth is that creativity happens all at once, in one moment, in a flash of insight. But the reality is that creativity emerges through time. In this case, 30 years from 1904 to 1934. Hopefully in your case, it'll be shorter and less time. But however long it takes, it's not going to be a single flash of insight in a single moment. Invention is collaboration through and through. The Landlord's Game started with small groups of players in many different towns, in fraternity houses, in university classes. Each person drew up their own board, made their own pieces, and changed all of the place names. Different cities had different versions of the rules. For some of the rules, it's lost to history where they came from. Remember that the Monopoly rule wasn't in McGee's 1904 patent. So where did it come from? I've read different versions of the history, and different people have claimed that idea. But, we'll never know because maybe that person is just the person who claimed it, but they really picked it up from someone else. The truth is that all of these game modifications emerged over time. It's the collaborative web, the network of people from up and down the East Coast. Each person contributes a small bit of creativity, a small spark of an idea. Then the ideas build together over time through collaboration. This is the way that invention often happens, not from one person having a brilliant idea, but from lots and lots of people making their own small contributions. Inventions emerge from sharing, collaboration, and conversation. In a way, it's just like improvisation, like a jazz ensemble, where one person contributes a small moment of creativity, a tiny new idea. Another person picks it up and builds on it with their own innovation. Over time, as all of these small ideas keep coming, something bigger than any one person emerges. The lesson is that creativity is always collaborative. Whenever you hear a lone genius story about an invention, remember that Monopoly was not invented by a single person. The way to participate in creativity is to participate with others and share in the collaborative creation that is creativity. The story of Monopoly demonstrates the power of collaboration to drive creativity. When you bring everyone everyone together, sharing ideas and building on each other, something new and exciting emerges. When you join together with your social network, the results can surprise you. And that's what creativity is, after all: unpredictable surprises and unexpected novelty. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps other people like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.